Hi everyone, welcome to Ekam IAS Academy. This is Dr. Nishana Jumudi. Let's have a quick look into what is repo rate in simple terms. The rate at which commercial banks borrow from RBI, the central bank of our country India, is called as repo rate in the most simplified manner. Now, this repo rate is known as the benchmark policy rate. In simple terms, it is interest rate. What interest rate? Short-term interest rate at which the commercial banks can borrow money from RBI. Now, when they borrow money, the commercial bank also have to give approved government securities in the form of collateral. Only then the RBI will give money to commercial bank. This repo rate comes under a facility called as LAF, Liquidity Adjustment Facility, which is nothing but the repurchase agreement or repurchase options using which a commercial bank can borrow from RBI. It is one of the most important quantitative instrument of monetary policy that is used to control the money supply or inflation in the economy. For example, when there is too much of money supply in the economy, what will RBI do? They will use the short-term interest rate called as repo rate. They will start increasing the repo rate so as to absorb or suck out excess money supply from the economy. And now, when there is no money supply, for example, like COVID-19 pandemic crisis, where India was slowly and gradually entering into recession, what will RBI do? They will start decreasing the repo rate so as to inject more money supply into the economy. And that's what we saw via Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, the 20 lakh crore economic stimulus package. The government injected money through various schemes, and also they made the interest rates lower by reducing repo rate. And now, currently, as per 2024 data, in the Monetary Policy Committee report, it was said that the so-called repo rate will remain at 6.5%. And it has been the same for the 10th consecutive time. And this decision was taken in the 51st meeting of Monetary Policy Committee. And now, when repo rate is constant like this, there should be some reasons to it, right? One is because of the too much, or let's say the excess or the uncontrollable inflationary pressures in our economy. It doesn't mean that inflation is too much. Inflation again is within the targeted limits called as inflation targeting at the rate of 4% with plus or minus tolerance band of 2%. Currently, our inflation rate stands at 5.4%. Again, it is within the permissible limit but not the ideal limit of 4%. So now, using repo rate, RBI tries to control all these perspectives as a whole. Some of the related concepts associated with repo rate is, one is bank rate. People tend to get confused with this concept. Bank rate is also interest rate, but different from repo rate. If repo rate is short-term interest rate, bank rate is long-term interest rate. Now, I told you repo rate is what? The rate at which commercial banks will borrow from RBI. Now, what about the general public? We, the general public, do not have a direct connection with RBI. We go to commercial banks and we get the money, right? So now, the rate at which commercial banks give money to the general public is called as base rate. It was like that before. Since 2016, this base rate is replaced with something called as MCLR, Marginal Cost of Lending Rates, which means that it is a minimum rate set by RBI below which a commercial banks cannot lend money to the general public. And this MCLR is based on repo rate. If repo rate is high, MCLR also high, and vice versa. And now, apart from that, there is another connected topic to repo rate called as reverse repo rate. Don't confuse, it is not exactly the same, but rather a slight difference. The rate at which RBI will borrow from commercial banks. You will think, why would RBI, being a central bank, borrow? The real meaning is like this. It means that at reverse repo rate, the commercial banks will start parking their excess or surplus funds with RBI. The commercial banks will start parking their excess funds with RBI. That is called as reverse repo rate in simple term. It is currently at the rate of 3.35%. And then there is one more topic called as MSF, marginal standing facility. Often people tend to get confused with repo rate and MSF. Repo rate is actually called as overnight lending rate also, which means in the same day, the commercial banks can borrow money from RBI using repo rate. So why marginal standing facility? MSF is the rate at which the commercial banks can borrow from RBI against approved government collateral or security. So now, what is the difference between repo rate and MSF? The same thing. But over here, if you see, though repo rate and MSF look similar, this MSF is a special facility provided by the RBI for the commercial banks. Now, when the interbank liquidity dries up or it is in a state of freezing condition, then the facility called as marginal standing facility is utilized. Using MSF also, the commercial banks can borrow money from RBI overnight. So both repo and MSF has overnight facilities, but this is quite easier in certain perspective. For example, there is something called as minimum borrowing limit. Commercial bank using repo rate is concerned. The minimum borrowing capacity will be, let's say it starts from 5 CR for repo rate, using repo rate. Whereas if a commercial banks wants to borrow using MSF, then they can borrow from 1 CR onwards and multiples of that. Now, this MSF is used only in extremely emergency situations. Other than that, the commercial banks always prefer what? The repo rate. And since it is used in such kind of conditions, the marginal standing facility rate stands at 25 basis points higher than repo rate. So now 25 basis points, you'll think, what is that? In simple terms, 25 basis points means 0.25%. That's all. Which means if your repo rate, or let's say our current repo rate is what? 6.5% plus 0.25% equals to what? 6.75%. That becomes your MSF in simple term. We just use the term 25 basis point. It is nothing but 0.25%. Why it is higher is because only in extreme situations, commercial banks can use MSF. And now, the more the need you have, the more interest you have to pay against approved government collateral or securities. This is how MSF, marginal standing facility, operates or functions. Now, another important point is that in repo rate and in MSF, only SCB, scheduled commercial banks, can borrow money from RBIs. But in MSF, scheduled commercial banks having a current account with RBI can only avail this particular facility. That is also another important point. Now, having said that, I told you about approved government securities or collateral, which commercial bank have to give to whom? RBI, when they borrow money via repo or MSF, whatever rates they want to. But in this approved collateral or government securities, if a commercial bank is using the facility called as repo rate, they cannot use any collateral or securities taken from the SLR, that is Saturatory Liquidity Ratio, which is nothing but a reserve requirement of RBI. That is, the commercial bank have to keep certain amount of reserves in the form of cash, gold and securities with the commercial bank itself. And currently the SLR stands at what? 18.5%. It is between 18 to 18.5. It keeps on increasing and decreasing. So now this SLR is what? It consists of high quality liquid assets. In simple terms, the assets that can be easily converted into cash, gold, security. Now in repo rate, if, for example, a commercial bank don't have any security to give it to RBI to borrow money, they can't touch the securities kept under SLR requirement of their bank. But if a commercial bank is borrowing via MSF, marginal standing facility, then there is a provision for them to use the SLR quota securities because it is in extreme emergency conditions. The scheduled commercial banks will borrow money from RBI using what? Using MSF facility. These are the major points of difference that you need to understand with regard to this particular topic. I hope a quick understanding indeed with current affairs data is gotten inside your brains. So stay tuned for more updates, my students, and I'll come with such interesting videos at Ekam IAS Academy. Don't forget to subscribe, put your comments as a feedback in the comment box, and make sure that you keep watching us. Thank you and Jai Hind.